Hello and welcome everyone to our event celebrating the Climate Council's 10th anniversary. I'm Dr. Jennifer Rayner, Head of Advocacy here at the Climate Council, and I'll be facilitating tonight's live event. Before we dig into some of the really important topics on the agenda today, I did want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting today. For me, that's the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in the ACT. And I pay my respect to elders past and present, as well as any Indigenous people on the webinar today. I want to acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also really want to acknowledge the leadership of First Nations people, both here in Australia and around the world, in responding to the climate crisis. Please do share in the chat where you're dialing in from this evening around Australia as well. So tonight, we're here to reflect on what the Climate Council, an independent, community-funded organisation, has been able to achieve in the past 10 years. We're also going to have a look at the bigger picture, what's changed, what progress we've made, and look forward to priorities for the years ahead during this really make or break decade for climate action. As we move through tonight's discussion, I know that many of you on the call have been involved in the Climate Council for a really long time. So please do feel free to share your favourite memories and moments from the past 10 years, as well as your thoughts on the path forward. The Climate Council team who are on the line will be reading all your comments and providing resources and links in the chat. And we're also going to have a little bit of a special announcement to make later tonight, so please do stay tuned. We're really fortunate tonight to be joined by our special panellists, most of whom have been part of Climate Council's story from day one. So first up, we have Amanda Mackenzie, Climate Council's CEO.
Hi, everyone.
We're also really fortunate to have Chief Climate Councillor, Professor Tim Flannery, joining us this evening. Tim is one of Australia's leading writers on climate change and an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist.
Hi, everyone.
Also joining us is Climate Council Councillor, Professor Leslie Hughes, who's also been here with us since the beginning. Leslie is a Professor Emerita of Biology and Pro-Chancellor at Macquarie University, a former Climate Council Commissioner and a lead author for the IPCC. She's also one of Australia's leading scientific experts on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems.
Thanks, Jen. Hello, everyone. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here tonight.
Thanks, Leslie. Next up, we have Greg Mullins. Greg is a climate counsellor and heads up Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. He's an internationally recognised expert in responding to major bushfires and natural disasters with more than 50 years experience as a firefighter.
Hi, Jen. Hi, everybody. Great to be here.
And finally, we have Climate Councillor Greg Bourne. Greg has worked at the nexus of climate change, energy, business and policy for over 30 years. He was the CEO of WWF Australia and later a non-executive director of Carnegie Wave Energy. And he's also the former chair of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency.
Hi, everyone. It's absolutely delightful to be here. And 10 years seems like nothing.
Well, tonight I'd like to start off then by turning our minds back to September 2013, 10 years ago. The Abbott government had just been elected and one of their very first acts of government was to abolish the Climate Commission. But within days, the Climate Council, like a phoenix, rose as an independent and crowd-funded organisation. People all around Australia, including some of you on this call, chipped in, showing that they valued independent, science-based information and really cared about climate action. Amanda, Tim and Leslie, you've been here from the start, so I'd be really keen to start with your reflections on some of the highlights of the Climate Council's impact over the last 10 years. Amanda, to you.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, it's sort of wild thinking back to 10 years ago. It feels both like a long and short time, but I think what strikes me as the achievements in that time was, if you remember back to 2013, it was sort of rock bottom for climate change. People across Australia, it was, we just had the drought and then we'd had rain, and it's kind of like, oh, is climate change really happening? You had really strong traction from the likes of Andrew Bolt and co saying, it's not happening anymore, it's been raining. The carbon tax debate had just happened. So it was a very low point. Obviously, Tony Abbott had come into power and was cutting everything on climate change, including the science. And we really believe that having that foundational source of accurate information was going to be critical, which it has been over the decade. And I think what I feel really proud of is a few things. The first is, I think we have done a really important part of putting climate at the top of the agenda. I think through the communications work that we do, we've consistently been the biggest communicator out there on climate, with amazing councillors and diverse voices being able to speak on the issue. I also think back to 10 years ago, and the only people that were talking about climate was sort of policy wonks and a few scientists and some politicians, and it was all very negative and often felt very far away from the general public. And I think that the Climate Council has done an enormous amount to diversify the voices speaking about the issue, from someone like Greg with a very strong firefighting background to doctors, farmers, solar installers, through our Climate Media Centre, which works really behind the scenes, but for 8 years now has been generating sort of 20,000 media items a year on diverse voices speaking about this issue. And I think that's been really critical at making it something that is very tangible to the Australian public and elevating it on the agenda.
What are your thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, wow. Well, that was a tough time back then. I'd come from chairing the Copenhagen Climate Council and seeing the debacle of the global work in 2009, pledging to go back to Australia to try to make a difference there. And then, finding 4 years later that we were being basically banished, sacked by the Abbott government in their very first act. So it was tough, and it was really Amanda that was kind of really helped us all so much, because she said, well, why would you accept to be sacked? And I'd never thought about that, being an old white bloke. I thought, when you're sacked, that's it. She said, no, there's this new thing called crowdfunding. And I said, oh, what's that? Tell me about it. She explained, and she said, should we give it a go? And I said, I think we should. There's a risk involved, but we really should give it a go. And it was the most important decision that we'd made. I was terrified that if we didn't raise money, because I didn't know about crowdfunding, I thought if we didn't raise enough, then it might set back the cause of addressing climate change in this country considerably. But as it turned out, the Australian people were ready and waiting, and within, I think, a week, Amanda, we had $1 million pledged to us, and we knew we could go on. And when I look back at what we've achieved, we have changed the single most important thing, which is public sentiment. Back in 2013, people were not as well informed as they are today. They were confused by climate change. They didn't realise the extent of the threat it represents. And through the hard work of the whole Climate Tech Council team and our fantastic councillors like our two Gregs and Leslie, we have been able to change that. And once you change public sentiment, then the politicians really have to follow. You change politics as well. So I think I'm right, Amanda, in saying that's our proudest achievement.
Thanks for that, Tim, and exciting, important to call out the vision that got this organisation going. Leslie, how about you?
Well, I'd firstly like to say that the Climate Council has always felt like my second family. I'm just so intensely proud of the organisation and the people in it and what we have achieved. It was as Tim indicated, far from obvious at the beginning that would happen. I distinctly remember, I remember our starting story when we started seeing the money coming in, because Tim had said to us when we were on the Climate Commission, if we can get the money together, do you want to keep going? Because we'll probably be sacked. And we all said, yes, of course, because we knew our job was very far from done. But I also remember having, as Tim just said, over $1 million came in that first week. And then we all met, I remember, Tim and Amanda will probably remember this, around a whiteboard in Simeon's house in Surrey Hills, which was our first donated office, thinking, well, what the hell do we do now? We've got $1 million of Australians' money. And I personally just felt the incredible weight of expectation that we had to produce something to make that worthwhile. And in fact, it was then that the Blue Mountains bushfires broke out. And we decided that our first report would be on bushfires. And 12 reports later, I'm just so glad that Greg Mullins is now a councillor, so I never have to write another one. But it's been a wild ride. I've had fantastic experiences with supporters on some of our fundraising trips. And as I said, it's not as important to me as my family, but it's up there close.
And I think everyone who's had the opportunity to be involved would say that you haven't let Australians down in the last 10 years, Leslie. It's really wonderful to hear all of your reflections on this. We're going to cast the net a little bit wider now, and I'd like to reflect on the progress that we've made in the last 10 years. So from those very dark days in 2013, when it seemed like things were pretty dire, where have we got to compared to now? Where have we seen the big leaps forward in climate action, and where are we still a little bit stuck? Greg Mullins, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Look, listening to Leslie, I just remember those 2013 fires, and they were climate driven. That was the first time in New South Wales we'd had major property loss before late November, and it was early October, and we'd had big fires in September. The fire season doesn't even start until October, where it's not supposed to. And we didn't have an El Nino. So it was the first time we'd ever had a major fire like that without an El Nino. And the government had just sacked the Climate Commission. Then I remember the report coming out of Climate Council, and I thought they're really on tune here. They really know what's going on. And the minister at the time saying that he read in Wikipedia that we always get fires in Australia. So it just sort of showed how good was that government. Go forward to 2018, and I was recruited onto the Climate Council, so I was able to speak up. I was Commissioner of Fire and Rescue back in 2013, retired 2017, and then coming up to this horror bushfire season, ringing around colleagues in every state and territory, former chiefs of every fire service in Australia. I remember talking to Tim and Amanda and Leslie and the Climate Councillors saying, you know, what if we got a group of ex-fire chiefs? Maybe the government would listen. Do you reckon they'd listen? No, we had Buckleys, just like everybody else, because we said two terrible words when we wrote to Prime Minister Morrison, climate change. And I look back, and, you know, that was one of the big downers for me. I was back on a fire truck as a volunteer firefighter, fought fires throughout New South Wales. Even went over to California with Climate Council and covered a fire over there. And there was a lot of media coverage of that because we sort of predicted what was going to happen. But that government just weren't interested, because if they admitted that they had to do more for these fires as they unfolded, they had to admit there was something called climate change. And so that was a really big downer. But then the up was Climate Council members out there pitching in, but helping emergency leaders for climate action to get the word out. And then people started to shift, and the Prime Minister started to shift to saying it was a factor in the fires, to saying it was driving the fires, to saying we must do something about it. And I thought, hallelujah. And look, none of that would have happened without Climate Council. So we started to shift the dial, and people saw that these natural disasters, supercharged natural disasters, were happening as a result of climate change. And then we were saying these fires won't go out unless it rains. And didn't it rain? It started to rain, and it just didn't stop. We had a triple La Nina, flood levels off the charts, another climate fueled extreme event. And I think most Australians now realise, through the efforts of Climate Council mainly, that extreme weather is driven by climate change. So we're getting there.
It's important call out as well, the role that our community has played in spreading and amplifying that message. And we know that so many of the people who work with us and support us do that great work in their communities, talking to people, talking to politicians, talking to others to help spread the message of Climate Council's research and reports and work. And it's one of the reasons we've always been so proud to be people powered, because we know that that voice of the community in our community and the Climate Council family, as Leslie says, is what really gives us the ability to have the impact that we have. Greg Bourne, one of the really big shifts I think we have seen in the last 10 years has been in the energy sector, which is one of your particular areas of expertise. What are your thoughts there?
So for me, the interesting thing is, I've been looking at climate change and energy for a very, very long time. I think the first time was 1988, so a long time. And it was a strategic issue for an energy company. And then I moved obviously into the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, WWF, and so on. So if I then say, the key thing is this is a long trajectory punctuated by all sorts of horrible events. Some of them are governmental horrible events, which we've been talking about. And so the first reflection is on exactly the time that the Climate Commission was abolished. I was chairing ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and we were told that we were going to be abolished too. But fortunately, we had a board that was tough. And we said, basically, you have to change the legislation to do that. And we were told, oh, no, just do what the minister says. And we said, if you wanted to bring back hanging, would you start hanging before legislation changed? So to me, one of the things is when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And when I look, therefore, at the Climate Council, it just moved and stayed forward. At the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, we knew the trajectory was away from fossil fuels, and we knew that we could do it if we really, really, really worked hard. And so in the energy world, the whole thing is about, do you embrace the future or do you hug the past? And the previous government, and indeed the fossil fuel companies, almost have no choice but to hug the past. They've actually missed the boat. To me, the most exciting thing, therefore, is communicating that the importance of change is critical, and that has been done so well by the Climate Council. The technologies are coming along and have come along amazingly. It's the fastest growing area. If you like, the stone is over the hill and it's rolling down. Fossil fuels are on the way out. We know it. All we have to do is accelerate it more. But it's been an incredible ride, and it's going to be a rough ride again for the next 10 years. But when going gets tough, the tough get going. We will.
That's a great reminder, Greg. Thank you. Amanda, you've been here every day of these 10 years. This is your baby. What are your reflections on how far we've come, both in the organisation and then in the sector, in the political space, in this important issue of climate change?
Yeah, I was reflecting on that, just how much, what it felt like at that time. And you probably remember how frustrated and upset a broad sweep of the community was with Tony Abbott coming in and wanting to abolish everything across the board with climate. But I love that sentiment, Greg, of when the going gets tough, the tough get going. I think that sort of, we tried to fight for everything that was there. So the renewable energy target, for instance, Tony Abbott tried to abolish that too. But ourselves and many other organisations, Sid mentioned, we are strong allies with so many other organisations too, that we're working to hold on to all of the bits of the furniture that were really important, but then also to change the community conversation to ensure that climate change would become central. And it was very hard at that time, like that first bushfire report that Leslie was talking about, there was a huge range of criticism, including them from the Prime Minister at that time, around us contextualising these bushfires when they were happening as being driven by climate change. We've always been very careful to be sensitive in how we do that, but believe that, like a car crash caused by speeding, it is important to talk about the cause when these things occur. And I remember Will Steffen in particular in this vein, because he was enormously brave through the whole of his time with the Commission and the Council, and indeed his whole career working on climate, in telling the truth. And I think that's what we have always tried to do at the Council, is look at the sheer scale of the challenge in the face and communicate that in a way that's very clear, but also provide pathways for how we can solve the challenge. And again, realistic pathways, but they have to be bold and they have to be done at scale and speed. So I feel really, when I look back on the last decade, things have changed enormously, and that gives me enormous hope for the future. I think we're all looking around us now, seeing the climate crisis writ large, really. Like, you look at the terrible Northern Hemisphere summer and thinking about more bushfires after such terrible bushfires only a few years ago, and the floods. But I think it's really critical to keep that sense of hope alive in all of us. I think about hope really as a verb rather than a noun. We've got to be cultivating it for ourselves, because if you look back, if we just lay down and died at that moment with the Climate Commission when we got abolished and said, oh, well, we're giving up, then we wouldn't have had the progress that we have helped to initiate. And similarly with everyone else across the whole of the Australian community that kept at it when it was unpopular and when it was hard. It's kind of much easier to jump on the climate change bandwagon now than it was 10 years ago. So we're working every day to think about this as sort of a wave of action. Now we don't want to be riding the wave that has been built. We want to be adding new molecules to that. So we're very much thinking about that as the future strategy in the Climate Council, how we continue to be pushing the envelope and saying, you know, there's a huge mountain to climb, but here are the pathways that help us get there.
That's a really quite inspiring set of reflections, Amanda, and people on the call can see why we all do find it so inspirational to work with Amanda every day. And thank you for mentioning Will as well in that answer. People will remember that Professor Will Steffen was an original member of the Climate Council. He sadly passed away earlier this year, and we're all very saddened by his loss. But that point about being honest and staring in the face of what is happening and what needs to be done, but remaining optimistic and remaining hopeful and remaining open to sharing that knowledge with the community and getting up every day to do that was such a legacy that Will has left for our organisation and for all of us who carry that work forward. I do want to talk about the forward-looking picture now, because we know that it's been 10 years of work from the Climate Council to get to this point, but the climate crisis is definitely not fixed yet. And we're all here because we care deeply about solving it and understand the absolute urgency of steeply cutting emissions. So I'd really like to hear each of your reflections on what needs to happen in the next decade. What should we be really focusing on and going big on in Australia to keep driving down emissions at speed and scale? Tim, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. Look, could I just add a word or two about Will Steffen as well? I mean, Leslie and I worked very closely with him, and not only was he a great friend and mentor, but I keep hearing his voice in my head, you know, and feeling that incredible bravery he had. He had an ability to look the science in the face, know exactly what it was saying, and not let it get him depressed, still have a lot of fun with us, but keep on chipping away at the problem. And, you know, that spirit is something that I hope he's given to all of us and that lives on in the Climate Council. And, you know, if I was channeling Will now, he'd be saying, get those goddamn emissions down as quickly as you can, electrify everything, get electric vehicles in place, no new coal and gas. A new Environment Act for Australia, a revised Environment Act that recognises the danger of climate change and allows us to regulate CO2, adequate biodiversity protection and forest protection. You know, I was surprised to read earlier in the year that globally, by regrowing forests, we're drawing down about 2 gigatons of carbon a year, which was much more than I thought we were. So protecting those forests, regrowing them, hugely important. I'd like to see us, you know, just dealing with climate change, with all of the impacts and everything we can do about, you know, stopping emissions as a front and centre business every day. I mean, that's what climate leadership really is. You wake up in the morning, you prioritise, this is the most important thing we should be doing. Everyone from our parliamentarians to our supporters in the Climate Council to broader society. We need to have that thinking that we could lose something very, very precious to us, our glorious environment and stable climate. And once you realise that, you work to, in every aspect, every dimension of the problem, to try to solve it.
Thank you for that. And people who follow our work closely and have eagle eyes will notice that behind me, I've got some copies of our Mission Zero report, which was released just last week, and which does talk about that point of speed and scale that we really need now, including that we need to actually be targeting reaching net zero in Australia by 2035. Why is it so important, Tim, that we work at that speed and scale of effort? I mean, that's well before what the government is targeting and what people are talking about. So what's important about net zero by 2035?
Well, if I just look back to 2009, and I mentioned the Copenhagen Climate Council, COP15, since then we've emitted around about a third, 25% to a third of all of the carbon that humanity has ever emitted in our history. So that's in that short period of time. So if we continue on like that, you see where that will lead. And that's why the urgency's there. The situation's already critical. We can't afford to make it any worse by emitting more than absolutely necessary between now and net zero. So we need to focus very, very much on that to give us the best chance we can. In a way, the last 10 years has been a story of changing the orientation, building the capacity, and realizing the new technology. So emissions are still growing, but we've got to the point where we now have the tools we need to make the quick switch. And that quick switch has to start now. It has to be complete by the mid-2030s. By and large complete. There may be some tiny areas that we haven't done, but by and large complete. And we can do that with sufficient effort. So that's, in a nutshell, I think why I think we need to move fast.
That's a really good point about what's possible now. And we have a line in Mission Zero which says that although the need for emissions reduction at scale is more urgent than it's ever been, it's also more possible than it's ever been before, because we have the technologies now, we have the clean energy, the affordable batteries, the opportunity to switch out our transport emissions with clean alternatives. And as you say, there's a great acceleration that can be upon us if we really go for it. Leslie, what are your thoughts on the decade ahead? What needs to happen? What we should be looking for now?
Well, to build on what Tim just said, and I should also say that if Will was alive, he'd be here on this panel today, and he'd be as thrilled as we all are to be here. I miss him every day. And I should say our Mission Zero report last week was dedicated very appropriately to Will, because it absolutely built on his work. Look, over the next decade, Australians have two responsibilities. One is to get our own emissions down, and one is to stop exporting emissions elsewhere in the world. So, we've been talking a lot about how to get our own emissions down. And as Tim noted, we do have the technology to do that. We've just got to roll it out much faster. But we also have, and this was the subject of a report released just yesterday called Beating Around the Bush, which notes that we have our main federal Environment Act, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, is actually a fantastic tool potentially to drive down emissions that we're exporting overseas. And that's because if we use that act as it should be used, as it's really should be intended to be used, to use environmental impacts as part of the approvals process, and not just local impacts, but global impacts, because emissions do not know, and climate change does not know jurisdictional boundaries. We actually have an opportunity with that act to have a sensible process to stop many, many fossil fuel projects going ahead. So the subject of that report that we put out yesterday is how we can use that act in a much more positive way, not only to look after our own environment, but to look after all environments globally. So that's where I think, we've got those twin jobs to do. We've got our own emissions, and we've got those emissions that we export overseas, and we've got to tackle both.
And the nature piece is something that you've devoted so much of your career to. How does thinking about nature and tackling the biodiversity crisis that Australia is facing feed into tackling the climate crisis? And, why do we need to do the two together?
Well, the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are inextricably linked. Climate change is now becoming the greatest threat to our biodiversity, and it's making all of the other threats like habitat loss even worse. So, and I think when people think about the impacts of climate change, first and foremost is they think about the impacts on nature. And of course, nature is our life support system. Without a healthy environment, we are not healthy either. So we can't separate out the environment from our own health and well-being. We can't separate it out from our economy either. So we actually need to tackle all of this in a holistic way, with nature as the absolute underpinning of everything else we do.
Such an important point, and people will be seeing a lot more from Climate Council on this point in the weeks and months ahead, because the report that Leslie alluded to there, Beating Around the Bush, marks the public start of a very big campaign for Climate Council to be getting Australia's national environment laws fit for purpose in the climate crisis, and that means embedding climate at the heart of that law for the very first time. So watch this space, and there'll be lots of opportunities for our community to get involved as well, because we know that this is going to be a big fight to get climate into our national environment law where it belongs. Greg Mullins, what are your thoughts on what needs to happen in the years to come?
Yeah, just listening to Tim and Leslie, and particularly thinking about habitat and biodiversity and everything. And I, framing that in my own mind, I remember New Year's Eve in Bateman's Bay in 2019, and animals dead on the side of the road. And I won't go there, but going back weeks later, no noise, no birds, no insects, no nothing. And just as far as you could see, no treetops, these incredibly intense fires. But look, I think about the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, and it said very clearly, some climate change and warming is locked in until 2050, no matter what we do now, because of emissions already out there. And what happens after that relies on what we do today, and we need to do it really quickly. I had, Tim saying we've got to hit the accelerator pedal, because by 2040 those black summer weather conditions will be average, one study suggests. So I'm really buoyed by the Labor government lifting the emissions target to 43%. That's way under what it should be 75. But then there's been 4 coal mines extended, or new, more coal and gas projects. It's like, and I said this in a newspaper article, it's sort of like saying, well, look, I'm off the drugs, but now I'm going to sell them to my mates so I can maintain my lifestyle. That's nuts. We need to leave this stuff in the ground, and we've really got to push hard on that.
Absolutely. And I really like the way, Greg, you don't shy away from that conversation. There's a lot to be done in the preparedness space, and there's a lot of people who are talking about those issues, but it's so important that we keep connecting those direct real world impacts to the bigger picture drivers. And I was fortunate to be in Canberra with Greg recently, briefing some of the crossbench independent members about these issues in the summer ahead. And Greg made the really fantastic point, and the important point, that if we don't tackle climate change, if we don't stop pouring more fuel on the fire with harmful fossil fuels, there is no level of adaptation we're going to be able to make to the extent and the ferocity of the fires that are coming up. And you could see the people in the room, because Greg's such a gifted communicator, really having that light bulb moment where they say, we've moved beyond our ability to respond here. We're really pushing into dangerous territory. We have to tackle these big structural causes, like stopping approving coal and gas, in order to be able to do that. And thank you, Greg, for everything that you've done to connect those dots and make that message so visible in the community. Greg Bourne, what are your thoughts?
Well, it was interesting to hear Greg Mullins, who I know and love well, talk about drugs. And there was a phrase that I used a while ago, talking about the products that we push from Australia, LNG, coal, etc. And I say we do it. We push our products with the zeal of a drug lord, not caring about the misery we create. And that, to me, is one of the real issues we have to face. The companies, but also the states, the territories, and the country. If you want to do it, you are basically being a drug lord and pushing products with that same zeal, not caring about misery. We have to stop that. So I am pretty sure that the energy transition will accelerate. It'll accelerate differently in different places. One thing I will say is that petrol prices will stay high. They will always stay high because there are some countries like the OPEC countries who rely on that revenue. So they have it in their interest always, no matter how much is coming out, even if it's going down, the price will stay up. They need that revenue to change all of the different places they have. So prices will stay up. I then think about transport. The transport side has not yet been won. And I think about, if you fill up at $2.50 a litre at the moment, my EV, if I do it off peak, is about a quarter of that price. And if I fill it up with the solar panels, which I can, it's nothing. So things are changing like mad. But one of the things we used to say when I was in the BP and the oil days with regard to some of these oil crises was, how do you double the fuel efficiency? How do you double the fuel efficiency quickly if you really need to? And the answer is you put two people in the car. So the behavior aspect of what we're trying to do right now becomes really key. Of course, we're going to electrify. Of course, we have to make sure that we recycle the clunkers and do things properly like that. We can't end up with piles of them. Yes, we need to ride share a bit more. Hybrid working is very definitely helping. Bikes, bike lanes, e-bikes, e-scooters. I haven't got an e-scooter and I haven't got an e-bike yet. I use pedal power. But doing all of those things becomes key. And the behavior aspect of transport really becomes key as well. It comes into policy. What sort of trains do we have? What sort of buses do we have? And so on like that. So I am sure that the electrification part is going to go ahead like mad. We need to push a lot more on the transport side. But in the end, all of us here on this webinar have to think about our behaviors, because our behavior delivers a huge amount of change if we think about it.
You can see why we all feel so privileged to have such a diverse and talented councillor group here at Climate Council with these different perspectives on the energy system and transport and fossil fuels and nature and the science. It's such a privilege to work with all of you and the different perspectives that you bring on this. Amanda, I'm interested in your thoughts on what the decade ahead looks like and what needs to happen. And particularly if I could ask you to reflect on how you balance the seriousness of the moment that we're in with staying hopeful about what can still change and the opportunity that this moment presents to really drive change.
It might sound strange because we are, as I said earlier, experiencing the climate crisis in a way that obviously we weren't 10 years ago, and it is very much real in the sense that it's all around us all the time. But I'm very buoyed by the momentum that has built here in Australia and around the world. I feel like change is coming very quickly. The technological change, the economic change, none of it's happening quickly enough, but the trajectory is moving in the right way. And as I was saying earlier about the Climate Council thinking about how do we build those molecules in the wave, so we're not just surfing, we're sort of building this wave of action. We're very focused at the moment, first on the big fights of this parliamentary term. So we've been engaged in the safeguard mechanism in particular, which was a really critical piece to get through the parliament, to demonstrate that the parliament can actually act on climate change in Australia, send that signal, but also make it more expensive for fossil fuel projects to go ahead. We've then got the EPBC Act, the environmental laws that Tim was talking about, fuel efficiency standards. So all of that is sort of buzzing along in our work. But at the same time, we're really deeply thinking about, at the moment, what it actually takes for Australia to move to getting our emissions down by 75% this decade, which was some foundational work we did a few years ago. Will Stephan, as Leslie mentioned, led that. And our Mission Zero report last week put that on the agenda again. We know that we need to reduce by that much, get to net zero by 2035. So our reports, it will be probably a series of reports are looking at how do we get there technically, how do we get there from a policy perspective, but also thinking carefully about how we get there politically, how do we get there socially, because there is a huge amount of change that is required. And we've done a lot in the last 10 years to socialize the solutions. So, 10 years ago, it was very much accepted that renewables, they can't power our economy. We've changed that pretty fundamentally now, and the technology has been very helpful, and the policy decisions that have now made it so, often renewables are powering a good chunk of the Australian economy during the day. But without the contextualization of that change, without bringing that to people day to day, it's people wouldn't have understood that renewables can actually power our economy. So, you know, the first step was just showing that solutions are available, that they can power the economy, and that they're beneficial for the community. But the next step is also to then contextualize just how much change needs to happen and get it in place. So one of the aspects that we're working on in transport, for instance, it's not just obviously about the fuel efficiency standards, getting more EVs on the road, etc., but mode shifting. So getting people to use public transport differently than they have in the past. And obviously this has been talked about for, you know, 30 or 40 years. But how do we take this on in a new way? How do we think about ways to incentivize people to use different forms of transportation, like Greg was mentioning, from electric scooters to motorbikes to a whole raft of different things? And one analogy that we use often is, you know, you might use your technology, you might use your phone for one thing, your computer for another thing, thinking about transport differently in our day-to-day life. So I think that as I reflect on our strategy and what comes next, we need to do that deep work to be able to put to the government and to put to all parliamentary, all politicians federally, this is what we think the policy should be before the next election. But then we also need to change the policy conversation, the public conversation going on around them, because that creates the conditions. We often talk about an on-ramp for politicians. We don't want politicians having to, and they won't, spend huge amounts of political capital on climate change unless there's going to be a benefit for them. And that benefit can be a virtuous cycle, that the more politicians are celebrated for doing stuff on climate, they'll probably do more. If they find it really hard, they'll probably won't do more, and others won't do more either. So we think about that on-ramp for politicians. So we're trying to get climate constantly at the top of the agenda for the extremes work. Obviously, Greg Mullins has been really critical in that space, same with Leslie and others, being very responsive, constantly putting climate in the national conversation, talking about international action. Attacking the social license of fossil fuels has been really important as well. You might have seen the work we've done over the last few years on gas. I'm really proud of that. I remember when Scott Morrison said, you know, oh, we're going to have a gas-led recovery to COVID, and that was a real indication that the coalition had moved away from we love coal to we can't talk about coal anymore. How about gas? And ourselves, but also lots of climate organisations all pivoted at the same time to being like, right, we now work on gas. And we've done a lot to share the damaging impacts of gas in terms of climate, but also on health, working with the Asthma Australia and a whole range of other groups. So that damaging of the social license of fossil fuels has been really important. There's been legal cases, of course, around the country, which our Climate Media Centre has profiled. And Jen has led the work that we've done on a fossil fuel sponsorship code, which I think is one of those next stages in how do you demonstrate that fossil fuels are just not okay to be sponsoring all of these different types of events and teams in the Australian community? How do you show that they're pariahs? So yeah, there's a lot to be really excited about what we're working on. And what gives me a lot of hope is actually the support that we get from the community, from all the people that are signing in today to watch this webinar. I remember back in the early days, and Tim and Leslie, I think you'd remember this too, having people, it was really a dark time. We've been abolished. Is anyone going to back us when we're coming up and saying, you know, let's create a new organisation? And people were putting their hand in the pocket and saying, no, we think science is really important. We think climate action is really important. And that has just continued through the decade. I find I'll give a speech or I'll be out in the community doing something and people will come up and say, I'm a supporter of the Climate Council. Thank you for what you do. Keep going. And that sense that we're all in it together, that this is a really hard fight, but we're going to stick with it and we're going to fight no matter what, that every fraction of a degree critically matters. Every ecosystem that we can save, every life that we can save is really important. And that if we are fighting for it together, we can win. And that sense that we've got this strong community and can't be torn apart. We're here 10 years on fighting harder than we ever have is what keeps me going.
That's fantastic. I'm struck there that you were talking a lot about the importance of changing conversations, and Tim and Leslie and others tonight have reflected on that as well. Changing the narrative, changing the landscape by changing how people think and talk and understand climate change. I'm wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about what you've learned through this past decade about how we change the conversation. What does it take to change public conversations that people are having at the pub, at the school fence, or at their workplaces? What have we learned, and what can we then use to take forward in the years to come?
Tim, do you want to go first?
And thanks, Leslie.
Yep.
And we've learned a lot, so much about it. And I think that it's a pretty simple formula that we've really got down now. The first bit is to get the story right. And we always have a detailed piece of evidence to start that, start off a process in changing the narrative. So for bushfires, Leslie mentioned that first report that we published was on bushfires. We then published another sort of 25 reports, I think, on bushfires, Leslie, that all said similar.
Not quite that many. It just feels like that, Amanda.
But that first
I
piece
think about 12.
Okay, well, I doubled it in my mind. It felt like a lot. So here's the foundational piece. Here are the facts. And here's the story that we can communicate to different audiences. So we've got the story and the message, then finding a whole range of people to communicate on it. So firefighters were critical on bushfires, for instance. On heat waves, we had people that were directly affected by heat waves that have been impacted, or flood survivors, a whole range of different people that could speak from the heart and to their communities. So finding the right people to connect with the audience you're trying to move, and then repetition and volume. You just need to keep the issue in people's ears over and over again, and every opportunity to get it in the media to create that volume. So we've built a very impressive media machine over the years. The stats is, over 250,000 media items in the last 10 years, which is, a huge share of the voice of those speaking out on climate. And it includes, the voices of myself, other staff, the climate councillors, but also all of the people that the Climate Media Centre has supported. They've trained over 1,500 people. It's a huge amount of people that are out in the community, out in the media, talking about it. Lots of smaller organisations on climate that wouldn't have been able to have their voices heard without the Climate Council working quietly from behind to help.
That's wonderful, and great that we're still here after 10 years to be able to tell those stories. Leslie, what do you find resonates for people most at the moment when you talk to people in your community, in the Climate Council community, when you talk to decision makers and others about climate? What is it that is sticking at the moment? What resonates?
Well, I think increasingly it's the relationship between extreme events and climate. And I think of all of the messages that we've promoted, that has been the one that we've had the really strong drumbeat on and has got through. I think the average person in Australia now, when we have an extreme climate event, thinks about climate change as being part of that. And I don't think that was the case 10, 15 years ago. As Amanda said, though, we do find ourselves saying the same things over and over and over again. But another really important thing is to localize it to people's experience, to talk about the things that they care about and they love. The importance of their family security, their food security, their financial security, talking about, will you be able to insure your house in the future? Those sorts of things really come home to people. And talking about the places that they love. We've done quite a lot on the impacts of climate change on ecosystems, especially on iconic environments like the Great Barrier Reef, and drawing attention to the fact that those iconic ecosystems are so much under threat from climate change. So I think, we've learned a lot over the years by practice in climate change communication, but I think it's that repetition and to localize it to the things that people love and point out what we could lose. That's what gets to people.
And we just keep hammering it.
We do.
Thanks for that, Leslie and Amanda. We're drawing to the end of our time together, and I want to really thank everyone for joining us and for everything that you on the call have done to make the Climate Council possible over the last 10 years. We are so aware that we couldn't have done any of this without the generous support of our members, our champions, philanthropists, funders, and particularly community members who have supported us through thick and thin, right back to the time that, as Amanda said, people put their hand in their pocket to get this whole thing going. Now, Amanda, I believe you have a special announcement to make, and because you're live, we shouldn't have any tech issues with that one.
Yes, thanks, Jen. Sorry about the video. We'll send it out. It is really beautiful and our team's done a great job on it. We're taking this 10th anniversary celebration on the road. We're thinking about this year as being our 10th year, a time to celebrate, and there'll be 2 special events in Sydney and Melbourne in November. It's going to be hosted by Osher Gunsberg, and Tim will be there, I'll be there, Greg, both of the Gregs will be there, and Carol Schwartz, who's our new chair, will be there as well, and Natalie Walker. We'll also have some surprise musical guests, and it'll be a really lovely evening. And so we'd love you to be a part of it. We'll have tickets going on sale soon, so we'll send you an email with those details. So look after that, and we'd love you to join.
We're all looking forward to getting frocked up and celebrating together. That is unfortunately all that we have time for today, but I want to thank each and every one of you for being with us. And to our wonderful panel of speakers, thanks so much for lending us your time and expertise today and right throughout the last 10 years. Now, our work is made possible by each and every one of you, our supporters. Every positive action adds up, and together we are all contributing to something bigger than ourselves. But we do know, and we've heard tonight, combating climate change is no small feat, and our actions need to match the scale of the task before us. So please do consider joining us as a member to support independent evidence, information, and solutions, which is what we do. There's a link in the chat if you'd like to do that. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our supporters, our donors who continue to make our work possible every day, whether that's our climate champions and our members who are powering the work you heard about tonight, along with those of you who take part in our campaigns and continue to have important conversations in your communities, in your circles of influence. That people-powered nature of Climate Council is such a big part of who we are and what we do. Of course, we also continue to set our gaze firmly towards the future. Climate is a generational challenge with really long-term action required to mitigate and adapt to what's coming. Our work to provide reliable, independent information on climate impacts and innovative solutions is going to be more important than ever in the decades to come. So this is a good moment to mention that Climate Council has a Gift in Will program. And I want to thank the far-sighted legacy donors who have already left a gift in their will to the Climate Council to secure a resilient, vibrant and equitable world for future generations, which is really what we're all here working to build. If you're interested in this way to safeguard our planet, we have posted a link in the chat that explains a little bit more about how that works in supporting Climate Council's work. But I do hope you've all enjoyed tonight's reflection on the last 10 years. There'll be an email with a link to the recording of tonight's event, that excellent video that we hope you'll get the chance to see so you can share it with your friends and family, as well as a link to a short survey. If you've got 2 minutes to give us some feedback on the event, then we'd really appreciate it. But otherwise, thank you once again for everyone for joining us tonight. And we're really looking forward to seeing you at our events in November, as well as to continuing working with all of you to drive deep emissions reduction this decade and to set Australia on a path for a bright future. Thank you so much.